Bro, every multi-platform game runs better on Xbox. Better frame rates and sharper picture.
You must be high! That's because of lazy developers making crap ports. If they optimized the game for PS3, Sony would blow Microsoft out of competition.
Literally all you have to do is put a game in both consoles. The difference is obvious.
The PS3's literal supercomputer.
Late to the party, whining about scraps. Get in the game, party pooper, or shut the... In the world of online flame wars, few battlegrounds are as infamous as Reddit. For years, the debate has fanned a crapstorm, transforming a marketing strategy designed to create brand loyalty, fighting over market share, into bitter, often ugly conflict between gamers. What started as a discussion about gaming preferences and comparing consoles to decide which to buy, if you couldn't buy both, has mired itself in name-calling, derisive factionalism, and fanboy one-upmanship. I'd say it's fun to sit back and watch, if it wasn't so sad, seeing grown-ups tear each other down over plastic and silicon, missing the broader picture of what gaming is truly about. Escape. Much better. Okay, simmer down, Reddit warriors. It's time to objectively evaluate the Xbox 360 and PS3. Strip the vitriol to uncover how these iconic consoles actually stack up against one another, and to see if there's anything we can do to improve the gaming experience. To compare the 360 and PlayStation 3, I'm going to use Crysis 3 because it's a late cross-platform game. It should be optimized to take full advantage of the PS3 and Xbox 360's horsepower, making it a fair comparison of the two consoles. In this article on Eurogamer.net, David Bearton explains, the PS3's frame buffer resolution in Crysis 3 is 1024 by 720, whereas the Xbox 360 used a slightly higher resolution of 1152 by 720. The PS3 appears slightly more blurry because it has to upscale the image further to get to 1080p. Unfortunately, I don't have any way to calculate FPS in Xbox 360 games. Digital Foundry uses an expensive capture card to record the raw HDMI data and then uses a custom program that counts individual frames. That's out of my reach, so I'll just show their results here. Check them out for more awesome comparisons. As you can see, the Xbox 360 manages 24 to 30 frames per second, and the PS3 18 to 26 frames per second. In some spots, the frame rate dropped as low as 14 FPS on PS3 and 16 FPS on 360. So yes, I can confirm the Reddit warriors are correct. Not only is the 360 sharper, but it runs the games at a higher frame rate, although both ran poorly. I think we can agree FPS drops into the teens is unacceptable on modern consoles. However, the 7th generation is hardly modern anymore, and the game is playable. Except for a few slowdowns here and there, it's not that bad. We tend to look back at retro consoles with the benefit of hindsight and unfairly judge them against PC or more modern consoles. High FPS has become a sort of standard benchmark gamers use to compare how powerful the computer is, and from that measure, both 360 and PS3 seem pathetic. In 2006, though, things were different. In the years leading up, the gaming industry had been marketing bits as a measure of performance.
This is it! The power of N64. The driving force in the next generation of video games. With 64-bit technology, you're a witness to moves and graphics that no other system can match. 360-degree viewing, three-dimensional graphic interpretations, anti-aliasing for crisp graphics, and too many other things that are just going to blow your mind.
People were still thinking in those terms. Oh, the 6th generation was 128 bits. So the PS3 is what? 256? I remember having a conversation with one of my high school friends that got a launch PS3. I couldn't justify paying the outrageous $599 US. Most people had CRTs when these consoles launched. They didn't have flat screen HD TVs. So I argued, since it's an HD console, you need an HD TV to see the difference. And he said, I don't know, dude. It looks pretty good to me. I was wrong in the sense that you can see the difference in shapes and polygons. The games can be more expansive and designed to take advantage of the more powerful hardware. All of that is noticeable over the 6th generation, but I was correct in terms of resolution. You can barely make out any anti-aliasing on a CRT, so any minor sharpness advantage the 360 has wouldn't be noticeable. They both looked awesome at launch. CRTs had better motion handling, contrast, and blacks than most TVs today, but over the years people did upgrade their TV, and on a native 720p display, which is the resolution PS3 games target, it looks natural. There was even a PS3 TV specifically made for it. In 2012, I got a 1080p plasma display, which also looked great. I missed that TV actually. I'm sure I probably could have seen the difference in sharpness there, but by that time I was satisfied with my choice to get a PS3. It was my first 7th gen console and looked great to my unbiased eye. You have to remember that as a console gamer coming off the N64, PS2, GameCube, Wii, OG Xbox, I was used to games having slowdowns, and I didn't care. Maybe if it fell to like 10 FPS, I'd be annoyed at the slowdown and think, wow, it's really struggling here. Oh well. It's over now, and became immersed in the game again. By the time I finally got a 4K TV where you can really notice sharpness differences between 360 and PS3, the PS4 was out. So during their reign, the 7th gen consoles were ready for the TV technology available and gave gamers a good transition to the modern era. It seems that every 4K TV I've had since made the PS3 look worse. They have aged, and their blemishes are showing. The fixation gamers have with judging the 7th generation based on FPS is unfair. It fails to recognize the role they played during the transition from standard to high definition TVs, or account for the attitudes of gamers at the time. They bring their bias to another time, take it out of historical context, and apply cancel culture. FPS really wasn't as big of a deal as people make it out to be. Not to the casual gamer, already used to slowdowns. It comes off as elitist bragging. Oh, this console's crap, it can't even sustain 30 FPS. Hashtag PC Master Race. Seriously, you can get right off my lawn. It's not fair to compare a PS3 to a PC. They're not even in the same league and never were. If you must compare it to something, the 360 is the best measuring stick. And yes, 360 has the edge in FPS. But what about hacks? Some say lowering the output resolution to 720p or 480p increases FPS. Okay, sacrificing resolution for FPS seems like the wrong direction, but that's something I can test at least. And there was no difference. The game has an internal resolution it renders at, regardless of the system setting. Then it's upscaled at the last step, either by the GPU or the digital video encoder, before being sent to the HDMI transmitter. That doesn't seem to influence FPS. So that's a bust. It seemed there was nothing we could do. Then, in late October of 2021, there was a major breakthrough.
It's awesome! 7,000! 8,000? No! This is impossible!
You'll hear Major's LeetSpeak username a lot in the PS3 scene. Major is a freaking wizard. He reversed the syscon and found that the RSX core and VRAM clock frequencies can be manipulated in level 1.self. It was on his radar at least as far back as 2019 on developer consoles, but it took another 2 years before he became the first person to actually overclock the RSX on a retail PS3. Over the next few months, he and Proto did a lot of tests to find an overclock that is safe for all consoles. Then Zico Xiao released the modified level 1.self to PSX Place. That's what Nate uses in his overclocked EvilNat custom firmware. 600 core, 700 VRAM, which is plus 100 MHz on both. Thanks to their contributions, overclocking the PS3 has become as easy as jailbreaking and installing an update. But I don't want to stop there. I want to see how far I can push it. Enthusiasts can create our own overclocked firmware using a program called Modified Firmware Builder, MFW for short, that hacks and maintains on GitHub. With that, I can make my own modified firmware with any clock frequency combination. Let's see if we can tip the balance back in favor of the PS3. Credit and thanks for MFW Builder goes to Bits Bubba for the original inspiration with NFW. Rest in peace, buddy. Toolboy for making the original MFW builder, Paxson and others for developing it further, adding plugins to make it more useful, and of course, debugging it. If I'm missing anybody else, I'm sorry. My buddy NASCAR1243 and I also added a bunch more overclocking combinations to the dropdown, but others have too, so it's been a team effort. Anyway, that's how I created these. Each folder contains an EvilNat 491.2 Beta 7 overclocked modified firmware to install any combination of core and VRAM frequencies I need. And all I have to do now is accept the extreme risk and install it. Seriously, it's extremely easy to brick your PS3 doing this. It's only for enthusiasts that are willing to brick or can use a hardware flasher to recover from it. It should go without saying, but don't think it's safe and blame me for your recklessness. You have been warned. For the console, I'm using PS3 number 12. It's alive! This is my Frankenstein CECH E01. A partial emulation backwards compatible model. It was my first fully successful 40nm GPU swap and has a new old stock CXD 5301 RSX. But before I start, I want to make a prediction about how high I can overclock it. So I used EvilNat to dump the level 1 and opened an HXD searching for the clock frequency 500-650 to retrieve the RSX info. This line of code contains the information I'm looking for. Specifically, this 4 is the foundry that made my GPU's 40nm die. In this case, it was TSMC. So that might make sense. I guess they made more of them for the global market than Sony and Toshiba did. If there were ever going to be any new old stock left, they'd be outside Japan, where Sony has more oversight. I bet all of my new old stock are TSMC then. I've been compiling this RSX info for a while and started noticing what I think is a trend in Sony Fab 40nm GPUs. From the consoles reported to the PSX Place forums and discussions I've had on Discord, late 25XX model PS3 Slims tend to have Sony fabbed 40nm GPUs that clock significantly higher than TSMC's do. I want to check who made my new old stock 40nm and make a prediction about how high I can overclock before I start, and then see how close I get. Since this is a TSMC RSX, I'm betting 850 core 950 VRAM. If it were Sony, I would have bet 900 950. So let's see if I'm right. You know what's funny is that I have a cheap smoker's 2501A sitting right here, and instead of it being my first overclock, no, I overclock my Frankie. Before installing any overclock, I back up my flash so I can recover from a brick. Then I started testing. Again, for the game I'm using Crysis 3, I modified the config.ini in the user data folder with custom CVAR values, effectively cranking everything to max. The PS3 hardware is fully leveraged at this specific test location. It has every element on screen: shading, lighting effects, water physics, particle effects, explosions, NPCs, and AI behaviors, a long alleyway for loading more textures into VRAM, and foliage animations, leveraging the maxed out draw distance, plenty of 3D models and high resolution assets that should increase vertex calculations, and VRAM texture cache operations. And of course, action occurring in the scene keeps everything in motion, with gunships and helicopters flying overhead. This one spot is perfect for leveraging everything the game can do to push the PS3 hardware. Test conditions. At stock speeds, the PS3 can only do 12 FPS in what I'm calling Murder Crisis while staring at this pile of rocks. So this is the consistent setup I'll use for all tests moving forward. The overpowered heatsink in this backwards compatible chassis should keep the 40nm nice and cool. It might make the overclocks more stable. We'll see. I set a static 35% fan using Webman mod and recorded temperatures, FPS, and power consumption to compare between runs. I measured the ambient room temperature using a thermocouple taped to the intake of the PS3. It's not touching the plastic where it could be transferring heat from the console, but suspended in the air in front of the intake. This is the true temperature of the air entering the console. Then I took the difference in room and GPU temperatures to get the change in temperature, or delta T. This is an even more accurate representation of the actual GPU temperature because it accounts for differences in room temperature between runs. Jumping straight to the results, the highest stable overclock I could achieve was 800/975, taking the FPS from 12 at stock to 19, a 37% performance increase. With this overclock, it's actually playable. That surprised me. This level of detail is absurd, and I didn't think it would even come close to approximating stock performance in this game at normal settings, which struggles to maintain 20 to 25 FPS. Now, you wouldn't want to play at these settings, it'll crash. I just needed to crank the settings for these tests to be sure I'm maxing the PS3's potential to generate good performance data. To compare actual performance gains and see how this overclock translates to real-world performance, I reverted the custom config file and compared the unmodified game to Digital Foundry's tests. I can't use their nice graph to record FPS, but I can play the game to the spots they tested and get the FPS from Webman mod using my highest stable overclock. I backed off the VRAM timings a little bit for a safe margin. So here's 800-900. As you can see, this game greatly benefits from higher clock speeds and easily outperforms the Xbox 360, which as far as I know can't be overclocked. I asked Josh, aka Octal450, if he was aware of one, and he said no, it's not possible. So take that, 360. Okay, so yeah, on modern games that are quite well optimized and run like trash on PS3, the overclock can help a lot. But a lot of the early games are poorly optimized and CPU bound. Developers couldn't be bothered to learn the PS3's obtuse supercomputing ways and released crap ports that an RSX overclock can't do much to improve. So win goes to the Xbox 360 on the fact their design was more traditional and friendly to developers. While the overclock can make up some of the performance, until there's a CPU overclock, there's nothing we can do to fix it. I mean, short of hacking the games and optimizing them. So maybe one day. Okay, we've seen there are tangible benefits to overclocking the RSX, but what about underclocking? Hold on, Felix. Why in the actual FPS would you want to underclock a PS3? I want to test a hypothesis. What if I downclock the core to 450 but overclock the VRAM? Can this make up for the lost FPS? Why, you ask? Because I noticed a trend in the data. The temps went up from core increases, but didn't significantly increase from VRAM overclocks. The hypothesis is that it could reduce the temperature of the RSX and not be noticeable. If so, that could be a viable method to help prevent the yellow light of death in early FAT models. They have a temperature-related defect that causes premature failure, and every little bit helps. I've already made several videos talking about bumpgate and how it affected both PS3 and 360. Check those out if you want to learn more. Long story short, yes, I was able to match and exceed FPS, but it only reduced the RSX temp by 1 degree Celsius. This approach is going to sacrifice some core performance, and tasks that are shader or processing heavy, like lighting, shadows, water simulation, explosions, particle effects, etc., will be negatively affected, whereas high-resolution texture loading and streaming data to and from the core will improve. If these could balance out and be unnoticeable to the player, that's a free 1 degree Celsius reduction in temps. But I can't judge this since I'd be biased. I know what I've done to the console and what to look for, so I decided to conduct a few experiments to see if the average gamer knowing nothing about overclocking or hardware mods, anything other than playing the games on PS3, could tell a difference. Experiment 1. A friend and his wife were staying over at my place, and I had him play 15 minutes into Uncharted 2 on 2 different consoles I'd prepared in advance for this test. PS3 number 3 I left stock, no overclock. PS3 number 5 I applied a 450-800 overclock to. Both consoles' FPS match at these settings, but number 5 ran about 1 degree cooler. Both are fully functional 90nm A01 backwards compatible models. I told him to play 15 minutes and look for differences. I told him nothing else and only took notes about what he said. I didn't answer any questions or give any sort of hint about what I'd done to the consoles. I wanted his genuine, unbiased reaction. He didn't want to appear on camera, so I'll just recount his statements from my notes. He chose to play PS3 number 3 first, the stock console. After 15 minutes into the beginning of Uncharted 2, he said, quote, "I didn't notice anything, seems fine. Nothing out of the ordinary," end quote. Then he played 15 minutes from the start of Uncharted 2 on PS3 number 5, which was at 450-800. He said, quote, "Seems like higher graphics, less blocky, but I'm not sure. I need to see the other one again," end quote. I then let him change the inputs on the TV back and forth between them at will so he could compare and try to pick out differences. He said, quote, "Nathan Drake's face on PS3 number 3 looks blurrier," end quote, but he wasn't sure. He thought that PS3 number 3 felt darker, harder to see. Switching back to PS3 number 5, he said it felt smoother. Character body movements felt more clunky on number 3 compared to number 5, but after double checking, he decided there wasn't a difference. Then he noticed that panning the camera side to side on number 5 was choppier. Camera movement on number 3 was smoother. At the end of this, I asked 2 questions. First, which console do you prefer? He chose number 3. And second, what was the most noticeable difference? And he said it was choppy camera movement. For experiment number 2, without telling him what I'd done, I used PS3 Mappy to change a byte in memory on both consoles that uncaps the frame limit in the game. So now it can run at FPS higher than 30. This should make frame drops more noticeable. Then I asked him to look for differences again. He said, quote, "The buttery smoothness is gone. It was going too fast," end quote. He was describing the soap opera effect, which is the weird feeling you get when watching 60 frame per second content. He was noticing the higher frame rate without knowing what to call it. He said, quote, "Number 5 feels like it loads faster when panning the camera," end quote. I think what he was noticing here was the increased VRAM frequency, which can load high resolution textures faster into memory and feed them on screen when panning around. I asked the same questions as before. This time he preferred number 5, the 450-800 clock speeds, and said the most noticeable difference was texture blur when panning the camera. Experiment 3. For the final test, I had him select which of the 2 consoles he liked best and put it up against PS3 number 12, my overclocked Frankie. He chose PS3 number 3. Again, I didn't tell him what I did to either console. PS3 number 12 is the EO1 40nm Frankie at 800-900 and performs 37% better in FPS. It should prevent frame drops below 30 FPS. PS3 number 3 is a stock A01 with 500-650 timings. It will dip below 30 FPS periodically. At first, I left the game capped at 30 FPS. He noticed blur in number 12 while panning and said it seems in between number 5 and number 3 in brightness and feels like there's a delay in movement. Then moved back to number 3 and said he preferred it, that it felt smoother, less motion blur. Bro, how you be dissing Frankie? I didn't say that, of course. I kept my mouth shut. At this point, I uncapped the FPS in both consoles. Going back to number 12, he noted a white artifact on screen. This is some very slight instability I didn't see while I was testing, but he noticed it. After a bit of switching back and forth, he decided number 12 seemed, quote, too smooth. It loads faster, feels like a higher level of console, end quote. He was referring to the 37% higher FPS, that it's, quote, going faster than I enjoy, and that number 3 is going slower than I enjoy, end quote. He preferred the 30 FPS cap being left in place and decided he liked number 3 better than the overclocked Frankie that could achieve a locked 30 FPS without slowdowns. He said it felt too fast. After the test concluded, I explained what I did to the consoles and he told me that he doesn't enjoy games over 45 FPS, that he gets a bit of motion sickness playing high FPS content, and that 30 FPS feels more leisurely. I think this is because cinematic games like Uncharted 2 are most enjoyable to watch without the soap opera effect, that we're conditioned by watching 24 FPS movies and 30 FPS TV shows. Besides some retro platforming games that are natural to play at 60 FPS, most cinematic games feel wrong above 30. Despite the current fixation of higher FPS as a metric for comparing your rig against your friends, I bet the developers conducted similar focus groups and concluded a 30 FPS target was optimal for the widest audience. And hot take, all this flubub about higher FPS is a contest of fanboy one-upmanship. Maybe my friend isn't the best representative of the average gamer, but his genuine reaction I bet is more common than you'd think. To sum it up, he was able to tell the difference between the stock 500-650 and 450-800 overclock. So I don't think that's worth the meager temperature drop of 1 degree Celsius. I didn't think it would be, but it was worth a shot. I'm glad I conducted this experiment. I wouldn't want to recommend lowering the core frequency unless it was an unnoticeable difference, especially for such a small improvement in temps. But if I'm underclocking, let's see how many levels I can descend before hitting limbo. How low can you go? And this is where it got really weird. My buddy NASCAR1243 found that 300, 900, and 300, 750 punched a hole in space-time and initiated core fusion. His FPS jumped from about 10 at 300, 800 to 18 FPS at 300, 900. And he accomplished this physics-defying, mind-bending, wacko nonsense with 7 degrees Celsius cooler temperatures. It's completely bonkers. Now, temper your excitement. XMB ran sluggish and you wouldn't actually want to use use a console like this. It's just a strange novelty and a curiosity from an architectural standpoint. As for why, in all that is reasonable, this happened, we still don't know. But I was able to confirm the same behavior myself on PS3 Slim number 5, Gorilla Smoked. To take this back to reality, I could tell the FPS wasn't counting correctly and only jumped to 18 while looking at that pile of rocks. The moment I looked around, it tanked. So I must have reached some performance threshold where it started affecting the FPS counter in unpredictable ways. I'm not sure. But I took this as a sign I'd hit limbo and shouldn't push my luck any further. I went ahead and tested a bunch more overclocks on this 2501A console while I was at it. It was also a TSMC fabbed 40nm RSX, but this console has 1,124 days of use on it. A well-worn beast. The highest stable overclock I could achieve on this Slim was 70950. 750 core caused some minor artifacting. That was my warning, I shouldn't push it any further. I was able to increase the VRAM to 975, but when I hit 1 GHz, this happened. Obviously, I can't update like this, which means I can't revert the overclock. I tried installing the update in safe mode, but as the console warmed up, the artifacting steadily got worse until it froze and couldn't complete the update. This is a software brick. Core overclocks give you more warning with artifacts, but VRAM isn't messing around. Remember, it seemed perfectly stable at 975, and in just 25 MHz, it caused a full-on brick. Even though I can recover using the NOR backup I made earlier, I don't want to have to use my hardware flasher. It's a lot of work. Even though the output was foobar, Webman mod was still running in the background, and by some stroke of luck I was able to use the Webman interface to set the fan up to 95% to cool the console as much as possible. We found lower temps helped stabilize the console enough to unbrick. I was keeping that card up my sleeve specifically to play here, and it worked. I was just barely able to recover from it. Phew, that was close. I decided to revert to 950 for a safe margin, so 700/950 is my max stable overclock. This makes me think they may loosen over time and not be able to clock as high, which could mean the overclocking headroom is a safety margin. As the console heats up or ages and specifications loosen, having a lower clock speed with plenty of headroom may extend reliability. It can loosen a lot before it starts to become noticeable to the end user. In addition to accounting for manufacturing variances, it also provides a consistent PS3 clock speed on every RSX. Even though later models could have been set higher thanks to more efficient silicon, imagine speedrunners having a competitive advantage because their super slim RSX runs at about twice the speed. No, console designers want the last model produced to have the same performance as the first, so that all software will run as expected and provide a consistent experience. But it's my console, so I'm willing to risk it. I don't recommend you do. What we're doing here is stupid risk-taking for the sake of enthusiast fun. Technomancy. And if I'm descending into the depths of madness, I may as well take it all the way.
Papa?
Up to this point, the core and VRAM voltages have been stock. No one knew how to voltage mod a PS3, so we could try boosting it for higher overclocks. That is, until right now. I'm breaking this news. The core voltage is produced by the buck controller. It receives a 6 or 8-bit binary code from the system controller during RSX initialization, which sets up the voltage ID, VID for short. The buck controller looks up the corresponding binary in its VRD 10 or 11 table, then sets and regulates that voltage. For the longest time, I thought that the RSX dynamically requested voltage based on demand. Like many processors today can increase or lower their voltage depending on how demanding the workload is. Lower at idle, crank to the max when playing a stressful game. I figured it's technically possible to program a VID table and just detect the voltage Syscon is telling the controller to select and instead increase it by an offset, perhaps using a rotary dial. And while I'm sure that approach could work, it was too ambitious. Required a lot of code, microcontrollers, hardware modification with flex cables, lifting pins, and would need a different installation method for each console, so I decided to abandon it. A friend on Discord, B-Rob, who has more expertise voltage modding PC graphics cards, suggested skewing the voltage divider on the feedback line. This feedback line is how the controller knows what voltage it's outputting. It measures the output, and if it's not quite as expected, it adjusts accordingly. By adding a resistor to the voltage divider, we can effectively increase the voltage by tricking the controller into thinking it needs more. The problem is that we couldn't find a likely target on the core buck controller, but we did find one on the VRAM. We measured the voltage coming from the regulator at about 1.78 volts. It worked out the math if you're into that sort of thing. Basically, all we have to do is add a resistor from here to here, and the voltage will increase according to this equation. NASCAR was the first to give it a try and successfully proved the concept worked to increase the voltage. I performed my own tests, except I added a potentiometer so I could adjust the voltage manually. I used a 22K limiting resistor in series, so the potentiometer can only adjust the voltage between 1.8 and 2 volts. That way I can't accidentally fry the video memory. Then, I intentionally bricked my console. I installed the 700-1000 overclock again. Spoiler, the VRAM voltage did nothing! All it seemed to do was make the VRAM hotter. It didn't help stabilize the overclock at all. Luckily, I was able to repeat my previous trick, maxing the fan and reverting to a safe clock speed. So, while we were able to increase VRAM voltage, it was not helpful. All it would do is burn out the VRAM faster. That's disappointing. Fine, VRAM is out. So, core is all that's left. I didn't want to make a complicated mod chip to spoof the core VID, so I started entertaining the idea of changing one bit state to see what voltages it would change to. I did realize through probing that the voltage of the RSX doesn't change dynamically, like I thought it did. This means that the VID binary is always the same. So I had the idea of pulling the pins high or low individually to change the bit state. There were all kinds of issues with this approach. If I run a jumper from one pin that's always high to a pin that's low, to change its state to high, I'm sending voltage back to the syscon too. So I'd need to lift a pin on the syscon. That might work on this 2501A where the syscon is a quad flat pack with pins I can reach, but on older models with ball grid array, I'd have to cut traces. There'd be different instructions for each model revision. Also, these VID pins are sensitive to current, and placing a jumper from one high pin to two in parallel doubles the current. It might burn out the controller and ruin the console. It's too complicated and has too many unknowns. Most likely it'll harm the console, and every console has a different VID anyway, meaning we'd have to calculate it on a per console basis. I decided this method was too hacky, so I abandoned it too. I'd run out of options. At this point, I didn't think voltage mods would be practical on PS3, so the overclock would be limited to stock voltages only. Of course it did. Major suggested I change an address in Syscon EEPROM using UART, and it worked. I don't know how this guy does it. Anyway, I became the first person to successfully hack the voltage ID of a retail RSX. I did some testing and made some VID tables to convert the voltage I wanted to the hex code I needed to set the voltage. And now I can make a baby dinosaur. I mean, boost voltage. You know what this means. Time to enter brick territory. Previously, I was only able to do 750 MHz core with minor artifacting, but 800 MHz was very unstable. I wasn't sure if boosting core voltage would have any effect after the VRAM results. So if boosting V-core stabilizes 800 MHz, that means this is a viable method to eke out a little bit more performance. Let's find out. Went from glitchy to mostly stable at 1.015 volts. There was some minor glitching, so I just boosted it to 1.042, and now it appears to have removed the glitching. So yes, VID hacking does help, but temps are climbing quickly. Cooling may become a problem, and I noticed some minor glitching as the chip warmed up. So of course, I went 100 MHz beyond the stable overclock and installed 85900. I fully expect this to turn out bad, or at least require some serious voltage to make stable or recover from, if I can at all. This is wild. It was unstable in XMB, so I boosted it another 0.5 volts to 1.089 volts. It removed the artifacts in XMB and made it in-game, but it was still glitching there. So I boosted another 0.05 volts, and yes, indeed, 1.142 volts stabilized, 850 core.
Mr. Hammond, I think we're back in business.
Temps took a real hit though, climbing 3 degrees Celsius. 900 core? Why not? Seems fine in XMB. Let's launch Murder Crisis.
It didn't work, but the set hive mind is...
I guess I found the limits of this power delivery system. I tested again and same thing. As soon as I get in game, pop! No light of death, just cuts power off. This time, Syscon reports a A080 1301 and A080 1002. That's a phase lock loop unlock and the RSX filter caps. That unintentionally confirms PLL unlocks can occur from power delivery issues. I don't normally associate Syscon error 1301 with filtering. I would normally think GPU, BGA, or bumps, but in this extreme scenario, it happened. I did see some system warning busy loop detected in the Southbridge UART logs. I noticed them when opening XMB in-game while it's loading, so a lack of filtering is causing interference with normal signaling. The power delivery in this 2501A was not designed to be pushed as high as 1.2 volts. Let's have a look at the core voltage on an oscilloscope to see what's happening. The max stable overclock I could achieve without voltage increases was 700-900. The yellow line is the CPU core voltage and the blue is the RSX. You don't need a PhD to understand what we're looking at. See how the CPU's voltage is nice and flat? That means the voltage is nice and clean. It's well under control. But the RSX in blue is all wavy. That's voltage ripple, and it's bad. With that overclock, I would get voltage ripple of nearly 80 millivolts peak to peak. This means there's clearly an issue with the filter, probably the caps. But this is still not enough to trigger voltage protection. It is definitely above what a well-attenuated filter should strive for. The general rule is 1 to 5% of the output voltage, so at 1 volt, the ripple should be 10 to 50 millivolts or less. As you can see, the CPU V-core, the yellow line, is flat. 10 millivolts peak to peak, which is fine. But the RSX at 80 is now outside the well-controlled range. That's without increasing voltage. 850-900 required 1.141 volts to stabilize, so an acceptable voltage ripple would be 11 to 57 millivolts peak to peak, or less. But I'm getting 120, and yet this is still not enough to trigger voltage protection. I tried 900-900, and while it was stable in XMB, it was unstable in-game at 1.141 volts. I then boosted voltage another 0.05 volts to 1.191 volts, and that made the game more stable, but there was still some lingering black speckled glitchy artifacts, so I boosted it yet another 0.05 volts to 1.215 volts. And this happened.
It didn't work, but this hive mind is pure energy.
Unlike most unstable overclocks, this was getting more and more stable with VID hikes. It's not due to the overclock being unstable. It was caused by one of these voltage spikes. I can tell that my RSX filter was not perfectly healthy to begin with. The Syscon error log contained a new A080 1002 error that had never occurred on this console before. You can see that increasing the voltage increases the voltage ripple and eventually overwhelmed the caps. That's the error code you get when the voltage ripple exceeds the over-under voltage protection, and on this model of PS3 it simply shuts off. I decided to add a few extra caps to address this lack of filtering. This might allow me to stabilize 900-900.
Devil in a red dress, call 911, I'm a killer. You know I hate to confess. Bang bang, got my hand on the trigger. The devil in a red dress, call 911, I'm a killer. You know I hate to confess. Bang bang, got my hand, call
Okay, take two. It prevented the 1002 at 1.141 volts and allowed me to get FPS and temp data for 900, but there was still some slight artifacting. On the bright side, the voltage ripple was reduced to 30 millivolts or less. This is within the 1 to 5% rule for a well-attenuated filter, so that worked a charm. More voltage! This time I boosted to 1.240 volts, and the voltage ripple was as high as 40 millivolts, but it appears to be stable.
5 minutes later.
Checking the Syscon error log, it caused A080-1002. The console was drawing nearly 100 watts at the end. I need to look into the datasheets of the ISL 6326 and the buck converters used, if I can find it, to see what the maximum current rating is. I suspect what's happening here is there's too much extra voltage for the Slim's power delivery system, and it can't output enough current, even though the caps are good now. That's the limit for this Slim. Now for the Frankie. Maybe it'll go further. This time I made it all the way up to 950-900 before artifacting became an issue and voltage increases didn't seem to be helping. Temps were climbing into the high 70s. This is on a Frankie with an overpowered heatsink. Artifacting changed from interference/fuzziness to green flashing tint and even worse noise. Temps rose to like 76 Celsius before I needed to crank the fan to 95%. And as the temperatures fell, the artifacting calmed back down. I was thinking maybe I just needed to cool it more and it would be okay. It was easy enough to back off the timings and revert to stock, so no harm, no foul. But at this point, I'm calling it. I don't want to push my luck too far with this Frankie. Okay, here's my final thoughts. First, overclocking will shorten the life of your PS3. That is a fact. My max overclock without voltage boosts was 750-950 on the 2501A. When the voltage is constant, power is proportional to frequency, which means power and thus temps should increase linearly as I overclock. But once I reach an unstable overclock that requires more voltage to stabilize, power is proportional to the voltage squared, and then temps begin increasing at an exponential rate. My results suggest it's fairly linear until I started boosting voltage. Then it took off and quickly reached a thermal design power limit. Core frequency increases had the most effect on both power and temps. VRAM, on the other hand, doesn't contribute much, which makes sense. RAM modules don't produce a lot of heat compared to the die. While these results are exciting, overclocking will increase the destructive effects of electromigration. The forces applied on the actual traces and transistors inside the die due to the increased activity of electrons passing through them, or more accurately, the electromagnetic field, causes a breakdown in the circuit. The copper can deform and break, leading to an open fault. The dielectric walls that separate them can be broken through, leading to a short. This process takes time, and when we increase frequencies, this time is shortened, especially when adding voltage to achieve higher clocks. The last thing I want to say is this result was on a well-worn console. I have seen some Slims make it to 1500, but not many. Most of the time they don't make it that long. I can't say it was definitely electromigration that took those other Slims out, but I am seeing the caps start to wear out on this console at least. It took an oscilloscope and stress testing with overclocks to discover they were wearing out, but they were steadily getting worse. That actually makes sense, and it confirms a hypothesis I've had for a while. People blame the NEC tokens for killing old fat models, but the Slims they think are bulletproof. Well, the Slims also have aluminum polymer caps that can go bad over time, but the Slims are newer, and the rating on these caps is about 1,000 hours, which is the same as the tokens. So I think what's happening is Slims are just newer consoles and haven't had as much time to die. And the same issue can happen with polymer caps, as evidenced by this console. They're getting old and they'll need to be replaced eventually. This is just how it works, especially if you want to push your console to the absolute limit like I did here. I'm just saying, even though it's a Slim, which people assume are invincible, this console was manufactured in 2010, and just 14 years later, it's showing its age. It's comforting to think electronics aren't like the cabbage rotting in the back of your fridge, that you can forget about it and expect it to be as good as it was when you stored it. But that's a mental crutch. The sooner you realize and accept this fact, the sooner you can stop worrying about the inevitable and just enjoy your console while it lasts. I give the same advice to those afraid to use their yellow light of death prone fat models who think that by not playing them, that'll preserve them. It won't.
I can't do storage again, I just can't!
Jesse!
I won't go back in the dark!
What's the matter? What's wrong with her?
Well, we've been in storage for a long time.
waiting for you.
Don't make it the toy that gets put on display and never played with. That's a toy without purpose. Like the cabbage that could otherwise have fed and nourished someone, eventually it'll rot away. Until then, why not let it fulfill its purpose? To play games, watch a movie, or listen to music. To bring you or someone else joy and escape. So take that, 360.